Welcome to Here is Where We Meet, an original podcast series produced by Tank.
I'm Michael Morris.
And I'm James Lingwood, and you're listening to Here is Where We Meet, a series of conversations with just a few of the artists we worked with across 3 decades as co-directors of Artangel, producing extraordinary art in particular places across London, the UK, and beyond.
Today we are joined by artist Marcus Coates and psychoanalyst and writer Adam Phillips to discuss their respective works for Artangel. The Concise Dictionary of Dress in 2010 was a collaboration between Adam Phillips and fashion curator Judith Clark, exploring the relationship between states of mind and states of dress. Whilst the directors in 2022 comprise 5 films in which Marcus Coates performed the experiences of 5 individuals in recovery from psychosis, as each of them directed him off camera.
You, Marcus, and just to ask you to describe what your collaboration to make this work, your work, The Directors, was, and tell us something about the genesis of the piece.
Well, it was quite a long-term project for me. It started maybe 6 years ago, I think. I was invited by a friend, Dr. Isabel Valley, to attend her sessions. She's a psychiatrist and she works at an early intervention psychosis clinic. South London Maudsley Hospital. And I went every week and sat in with her in her consultation room and met her patients. And I'm not quite sure why she asked me. I think it's because she thought I'd just be interested in her patients' experiences and stories. She was involved in a project called the School of the Imagination that I made. And we asked her to be there just as a sort of safeguarding issue, just to make sure the people we were working with were okay. We were asking them to go deeply into their imaginations and use that as a significant reality for themselves. So, yeah, she saw that experience and said, okay, yeah, Marcus might be interested. So, yes, I went along. After a couple of years of doing this, I think, and experiencing a similar issue regularly, which was this real discrepancy of empathy. This sense that I was very aware of my own struggle to empathise with the experiences of the patients. I saw a struggle also between the patient and the doctor, and also saw a struggle with the patient and their families and communities. I think as someone who is sort of, not just in my work, but just in normal life, I like to breach those gaps, and I like to look at personally why that's important for me, but also culturally why that is difficult. I thought, okay, look, this is something I want to approach. And then I started talking to Michael about the idea, and it was a very rough idea, the sense that maybe it was impossible to understand these experiences. Maybe the attempt was futile, but the attempt was maybe the important thing. There are degrees of understanding, the degrees of empathy. And maybe that's what we could start to approach.
I mean, we began, I think, by imagining a piece of theatre. We actually even went to see a space to do it live. This was before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I think quite a lot of the final form was to do with the pandemic and the communication with those we work with lived experience of psychosis, who became the directors, largely through a year spent on Zoom. Getting to know them remotely.
Yeah, I actually I think all the most interesting works that I have made, the form comes from the process. So the form came from those discussions with the participants. It came from talking to Michael at length. It came from talking to my family, talking to myself about it. Yeah, and it generated through that, really. And I suppose that was the essential work, actually creating a framework where this discussion could happen.
I mean, that could equally be a way of describing your work, Adam. I mean, your work is about discussion, listening, talking, creating narratives in a very similar way. But there's not necessarily an objective that you set off with either.
No, that's right. And having worked in the health service for 17 years as a child psychotherapist, I was now, when we met, in private practice, and I really missed doing collaborative work. Because, of course, my work is collaborative, but only with one other person. There's no group. And when I met you, Michael, I'd never heard of Artangel, which was a reflection on me and not on it, obviously, because I wasn't familiar with sort of contemporary arts and so on. Very quickly, when I was talking with Michael, I had no idea initially. I had lots of ideas talking to Michael, and I thought this was amazing and a collaborative opportunity. There was a coincidence. Michael approached me quite soon after I had fallen in love with somebody who was herself an exhibition maker and a historian of dress. And she and I had talked intermittently but casually about doing work together. We had no idea what we would do. I spoke to Michael, had various ideas. I spoke to Judith, and very quickly we came up with the idea of the Concise Dictionary of Dress, which was we then spoke with Michael, and then it elaborated itself from there.
I mean, as always, with both of these projects, the directors and the Concise Dictionary of Dress, there was no sight, although we knew that sight would enrich meaning. Ultimately, we didn't know where it would be or when it would be. And once we'd found Churchill Gardens Estate in Pimlico, in Marcus's case, and once we'd found Blythe House, where the V&A store their items that are not on display, which is the vast majority of their collection, both projects took life from the reality of the site.
I mean, for me, it was quite startling, the effect of finding the site, because it was as though going there and knowing something about it almost generated, in and of itself, ideas. So it was a very strange mixture of things, and it had, as it were, an unconscious effect, I think, on me and on Judith as well, that this seemed exactly the right place for a project we had no idea about.
Actually, interestingly, for the experience of both your very different works, so with Marcus, there were 5 different films installed in 5 different places across the estate in Pimlico. With you, Adam, it was a kind of route through the stores of the Victorian Albert where you would encounter various installations or mise-en-scènes of objects, artifacts, and words. So in both cases, I think the kind of gaps in between as it were, the more direct experience with the work were very important. You know, I can't imagine, Marcus, I mean, it will happen, I'm sure, but if you had your 5 films alongside each other in a gallery, that, you know, the experience could have been anything like the same, you know, just allowing the kind of environment to seep into the experience seemed very important.
Yeah, I think the films themselves attempt to set up a relationship with the viewer. There was a cohesive relationship there that's an attempt to create something. But I think the idea of creating in this real-life setting became really important as well. And it just adds a whole nother dimension in that it forces, in a way, the viewer to take on their own reality much more. And to always imagine when we were looking around Pimlico and going to some of the shops and the surgery and people's flats and houses, I remembered what it's like when I was a child and you go around to someone's house for a meal and everything, as soon as you go through the door, everything smells differently. And the food, although it's baked beans, there's something different about them. The glass of milk, there's something strange and odd about it. The carpets are longer. The TV's louder and more colourful. Everything is different. And you are forced to negotiate that reality. And after a while, it becomes normal. But that's kind of the feel I want. And I wanted your own reality to be reflected back at you. And when you walked out of that shop and you had to cross the street to go into another place, I wanted you to experience life and see that again. So there were 5 films. Each film shows me ostensibly. And off camera, I'm collaborating with a participant who is directing me to enact their experiences of psychosis. So you don't see them, you hear their voice, and you see and hear me responding to them and asking me, how the hell do I do this? You mostly see me failing, but it's the struggle and the attempt to understand, which I think actually is quite fruitful. Each of the films was shown in a different place, one in a flat where we filmed the work, one in a doctor's surgery, another one in an antique shop, another one in a shop. There was this journey between these sites and this negotiation of the sites themselves, which was quite intrinsic to the work.
And in your case, Adam, could you also describe the journey and some of the places where you were inviting people to?
We called it the Concise Dictionary of Dress because it was brief. It wasn't comprehensive. There were a set number of words like taut or tight or fashionable or whatever. And the idea was that I would produce it sounds a bit arch this, but a provocative definition, not entirely intended to provoke, but to interest primarily. There wouldn't be an ordinary dictionary definition, but would be a kind of definition. And Judith would match this up with an installation loosely connected to dress. So there would be my definition, and then there would be the installation. As you walked around Blythe House, which is the most enormous warehouse, so you all the time would be walking past and through and round artifacts that were stored. Suddenly you would come across something that wasn't exactly stored. It was there to be seen, and it was exhibited. And so immediately there was a contrast between the hidden and stored and the exhibited and seen. Also, it was literally a journey, as you had to go through the whole building. It was very, very elaborate. And it was unpredictable simply because all the installations and definitions were different, even though they were linked with some idea about what would be a useful and interesting way to talk about dress, among other things, that might link with other things, so that I could bring something of my own discipline to bear on it and something of Judith's.
Was the idea of working in a storage, a huge storage area, particularly interesting to you because of your work?
Well, it was incredibly interesting, and for two reasons. Partly to do with Judith's work, as in she showed me how people who design clothes are historians of their medium. So there's a lot stored in any given dress as an artifact. Secondarily, of course, what I do is to do with what people have stored, wittingly and unwittingly, of their past, that's actually affecting or limiting their present. So it was a really powerful and therefore, I think, very resonant symbol. I wasn't thinking this when I was there, but in retrospect, it's clearly that was the case.
I mean, actually, you mentioned provocative, which was one of the words that was defined within the installation. And you define that in the kind of written dictionary as a quest for a more reflective, a more interested mirror, the research of the shy. And there's a connection there, I think, with the way that you approach the research, Marcus, at the Maudsley, not quite knowing how much, you just to watch, to observe, before really knowing why you were there.
Well, that I think was really important, that I wasn't there to create anything. I didn't have an outcome in mind. I didn't want an outcome in mind. I think that observing was really important. In a way, just to find and discover my own relationship to this and not to presume anything, really.
I mean, I think you probably describe, Adam, the journey you go on with a patient in very similar ways.
Yes.
There's no outcome in mind.
No, that's right. And in a way, the outcome is made up as you go along. But I thought what was very remarkable about your films was you did something or something happened that facilitated people to speak very, very, in a way, intimately about very, very difficult things. And that's extremely rare in my experience, because either it's sensationalized or it's banalized in some way. It's made normally weird. And I had a real sense of your films. These were very distinctive individual people. They were not diagnoses.
But that came from, I think, something which both of you would relate to, which was relationship building to create trust, which I suppose you'd call, Adam, the therapeutic alliance, which you build on to actually try and maintain a curiosity about who it is that you're working with and what might be going on.
Yes, I think of what I do as more a curiosity profession than a helping profession. Because when it becomes a helping profession exclusively, it becomes potentially very coercive and very normative, very quickly, I am the expert, helping them to join me in normality, or my version of normality. Whereas if it's a curiosity project, then we are both finding out as we go along, and we cannot know the consequences of what we'll find out.
I mean, I remember us talking about expertise, Marcus, that the directors were experts in their own story, so let them tell it through you as a medium.
Yeah, it wasn't for me to impose my reality as a normative experience.
But also these people, these collaborators, they were asking questions back of you.
They wanted outcomes for themselves. They were motivated to do it for themselves. A common thing that came up really right from the beginning of speaking to them on Zoom during lockdown was that this was better than therapy. And I was sort of always inquiring after this. I said, well, you're not trying to help me, and you're not trying to assess me. And we're just interested in each other. And that's something that I really tried to create from the beginning. And it had to be very distinctly different from the environment where I encountered patients before, was that this was a mutually made framework, that we both were in it for very clear reasons, and none of those were helping each other, really.
Can I just come back to something you just said about it being better than therapy? Because it shows in a way, I think, or suggests to me that the wish to help or be helped can get in the way of the effect people can have on each other. And that actually it can be stultifying. And I don't know this, but I presume that there being no project of help meant all sorts of other things were possible. And people might be able to say things or feel things or think things that had nothing to do consciously with being helped. And therefore they were free.
I think it's quite liberating.
Yeah, it must be.
Yeah. Also, if you imagine some of the directors and their past, deeply, all of their past in a way, from sort of their 20s onwards, has been deeply rooted in this help care culture.
Yeah, they've been over-directed.
Yeah, and to liberate them from that as well, and to that conversation, have an alternative conversation that isn't defined by that, I think was really important.
Yeah, and also to empower them in the relationship with someone who'd normally be an authority figure. You were not really an authority figure, Marcus. You were many figures to them, but authority wasn't one of them.
No, and that was quite a tricky balance for me to. I don't know how you find this, Adam, and James and Michael, when we're all facilitators in a way. How you remain open to unending uncertainty, how you hold that, how you remain yourself, but also allow yourself to be a blank canvas for someone.
Yeah, and how you can resist the temptation to be an oracle, to actually really be the one who knows what's going on.
And ascribe narrative.
Yeah.
Through being patient, I think, and actually allowing the use of time to let a project develop or let a thought develop. And if it doesn't develop and it's not going to develop, then not to sort of kill it at birth, to let it sort of wither naturally. There are quite a lot of times James and I as producers might feel that an idea is not going in the right direction, but we wouldn't always say that. It wouldn't be helpful, I think, at certain points to be too interventionist as producers. The same as it wasn't helpful for you, Marcus, to be too interventionist in the writing. I mean, I remember one of the screenplays had an ending that both you and I really found problematic. And it was, how do we change that? That's what the director wants to say. That was tricky.
I mean, I began to feel, as I became more experienced as a producer, that one of the key skills, if you like, was actually stepping back rather than trying to step forward and try. One of the temptations when you're kind of young and you kind of really want to make things happen is when you don't think something is going well, you want to insert yourself in the conversation to try and, move it along. But actually, as Michael said, being patient and stepping away and allowing things to evolve is more generative.
It's not worlds apart, is it, from being a certain kind of parent, in which you're willing to be affected by your child or the child, and not simply foisting things on them and directing them, and starting in the position where you know what's best for them.
There is a trust, I think, isn't there? Yeah. And I'm not sure where that is situated. I mean, the inclination is also, okay, I've got to trust myself, or I've got to trust that person. And that sets up this very strange difficulty because you're transitioning between them, yourself and somebody else constantly and not knowing where to put your trust. But actually the trust is in between you. You're saying, actually, I just trust the process or I trust life and something will come out of this. And neither of us are in control of this. But both of us are invested in something happening. And that's, in a way, all you can trust.
I think one of the most remarkable exhibitions of empathy that I've seen in recent years was your collaboration with an elderly man in a hospice, which led to a work of yours called The Trip. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship you formed with this man, the trust you built with him, and what that enabled you to do?
It was a project with the Serpentine Gallery called Skills Exchange. And I worked with the Chinese community for about 2 years, and without no outcome in mind, and nothing really emerged from that. And then I sort of had this feeling that I wanted to work with people who were terminally ill. I don't know why. It was quite an intuitive thing. I started to work at St John's Hospice in London, and I went there every week for about 2 years, just having conversations with people there. And usually the conversation would turn to, so what are you doing here, Marcus? Are you ill? What's your thing? And I said, no, I'm an artist, and I'm just here to chat and stuff. And they said, what can you do for us? And that was kind of one of the first times I was really faced with that question and the responsibility of actually, what am I for in this context? I'm not here for my art. I'm not here for me. I'm here for others. So yeah, I started to talk about how I could be of service to people. And one of the ways was I felt I had a vivid and rich imagination, and I could perhaps help other people live through their imaginations more, if that was a significant reality for them or a place they wanted to go to. And with some people, not all obviously, but some people, that was a very important place. They were confined to their rooms to see out their last days, but their imagination was alive and vivid, and they had places they wanted to go to see and experiences they wanted. So I felt like, okay, maybe I can help facilitate those experiences, extend those experiences. So there were a number of concurrent or parallel experiences I was talking to people about, and one of the significant ones was a guy called Alex, who wanted to go to a remote community in the Amazon, and he wanted to ask them some questions about life. And I said, okay, I'll go, ask some questions, your questions, I'll get the answers, I'll come back and I'll tell you about them. And that's what I did. And the film really was, we didn't see either of us, it was just the view out of his hospice window, and you heard our conversation before I went, where he was asking me what to ask them. And as soon as I got off the plane, when I came back from Ecuador, I went to the hospice and we filmed the same scene and the conversation when I got back. He started off saying, well, hang on, this is your trip. And what am I getting out of this? But after a couple of weeks of talking, he phoned me up the night before, actually. I left and he said, this is our trip. He was very excited about it and very excited to get his answers.
What was so profoundly moving was that what you looked at was a locked-off camera, which was his view out of the window, which hadn't changed during the time that you were in the Amazon, Marcus. And from the left speaker and the right speaker, you had Alex's voice, Marcus's voice, discussing what Marcus was going to do and what he had experienced when he came back. But what was being looked at was the same. It was the view out the window through the fluttering net curtains. It was profoundly moving to watch.
Your description of this collaboration sort of brings to mind also something you said about analysis, Adam. You talked about it as being practical poetry.
Yeah, and something about it being really about an exchange. And of course, you can't know what that's going to be because it's unrehearsed, ideally. But that there's something about exchange that is extremely generative, given half a chance. And that sounds very, very much in that film. Because when you were describing it, I was thinking Alex was in at least two places at once. He was with you there, in his mind, and you were with him, and you were doing something together. And that is very extraordinary, even though it might seem, as it were, practically rather straightforward. It seems to me really extraordinary.
Yes, but there's conflict there as well, I think. When I got to the Amazon, I immediately got off this tiny little 2-seater plane that landed in this jungle, and I got in this canoe. I went down this river for a day or so to this community, and taking everything in, I'm thinking, I need to take this in for Alex. I need to describe this to Alex. How would Alex be seeing the world? In a way, second guessing that was ruining everything. It felt very inauthentic, actually. And it was at that point I made the decision to feel and experience everything as myself. And in the way, that was the best way to impart this.
You were obviously conscious that this was towards the end of Alex's life, and I think he died not that long afterwards. I mean, how did you feel about his death, given that you had that experience with him?
Well, I think the conversations were the work for him. But there was also an afterlife of those conversations, because he had, as he said, we talked after the filming, before he died, and he said he had another bend in the river to go down. He had another conversation to have. And particularly when he was lying there in pain, he had somewhere else to go. His mind didn't feel constrained. He had some more information. Of course, he'd already been on that journey. He'd been on that journey 1,000 times. And that became apparent sort of after the first time we talked about it, really, before I left, that he'd already had this journey. And it was my job to extend that, not to confront it.
Because in a way, in doing this, you were temporarily the guardian of his future self, weren't you?
I felt like I was providing more unknown to him.
I mean, that seems like a kind of therapeutic alliance of a kind. But yet it's obviously not the same model as you pursue, Adam.
But the question is always going to be, what can we do for each other? You know, what do we want to do and what are we capable of doing? And also, how have we come to what we think we want to do together? And those are all questions that are up for grabs, if you see what I mean. But it would seem to me the most interesting future is the one in which one is doing things that are at least slightly against the grain, or are not easy or obvious, in the sense of you're intrigued enough and you're, in some sense, challenged enough, and there's enough risk for it to be enlivening.
I think that sort of central premise, how can I be of service to this situation or to you or to whatever, and also how that can be reciprocated, actually. Yeah. It's how we actually talk about that, how you actually just bring that to the table. By saying, how can I help you, you can be saying, in not a very useful way, you need help. Yeah. Because this is why I'm here, to help you. But there is acknowledgement that we all need help. And there's acknowledgement that I need help. Yeah. And I wanted to do something. And being very honest about what I want for something can be very difficult, because I often don't know. Yeah. And none of us know often how we need to
And that
help.
might be the point of the conversation, is to enable one to find out.
Yes, exactly.
Because it's a bit like thinking, if I think I'm a very kind person, and I go on through my life being very kind, but I never ask somebody else what it would be from their point of view for me to be kind to them, then effectively I'm tyrannising people with a fantasy of my own kindness. If you don't have the conversation, the fundamental thing is missed. You just wouldn't know. I would just think, I'm really kind.
I mean, one of the things that we were nervous of in the directors was the humour. We found ourselves laughing quite a lot, and actually the directors laughed as well. And there was quite a lot of moments of humour, which in the end felt okay, because it wasn't laughing at the situation, it was laughing because of the situation. I mean, both of you used humour a lot in your work, I think. I mean, do you think that that humour reveals or conceals?
Presumably both, but obviously there's such a pleasure in being amused and being amusing that there must be something in it, if you see what I mean. I'm reassured, I suppose, by the basic model, which is, I can't say to you, I'm going to tell you a great joke. I can tell you a joke, and you'll tell me whether it's great for you. Well, that seems to be a good picture, so to speak, of how this should work. But when people find that they amuse each other, it's wonderful. It's really collaborative, unconsciously collaborative.
It's also, when you tell a joke, you don't need to understand the joke. You just get it.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think, for me, well, when we were doing the directors, the humour was a big thing that I hadn't really expected. Although, sitting with Dr. Valley in her consultation room, there was a lot of humour there. And that's one of the things I really admired about her willingness to go into these areas with her patients. So, yeah, I was a little bit prepared for that. But, yeah, actually everyone, all 5 of the directors, there was a lot of humour in those conversations, those initial conversations. And I said, is it okay if we create these funny moments? And they were all surprised that I was worried about it. The idea that we have to be reverent about illness and serious about it and pay respect to that. In a way, they didn't want that respect to the illness. They wanted respect to them. And they are funny people. And they've had funny situations. And so that was something important to acknowledge.
Marcus, just as another area of your work, which seems to be recurrent, is your interest in the natural world, and particularly with birds. Why do you think you kind of return to that, if it's right in saying that, on a fairly regular basis?
If I really think about it, and it is a bit of it's not something I think about much, it's very intuitive. It's a very important relationship for me. But why that is, I think there are a few reasons. One of them, if I think back, my first experiences of the natural world were through somebody else. They were through my relationship with my brother. And when we went into the woods, him and his friend, typically, they'd know about stuff. Whether they're making it up, I'm not sure, but they'd know about stuff. They'd have this key, and this invisible key. They understood what was happening. They might know where a bird was, or where the newts would be, or they'd know about stuff. And that always felt like that was an important thing to know. And I got infected by that curiosity. So that felt like an important thing that I could never really reconcile enough. I could never really have enough of those keys. And I was always looking to that and to other people for that information. So that became quite an obsessive thing almost, to find people who could help me. But also I think there's a real sort of sense of what self is. And that came later in life when, in a way, I gave up art. And I gave up this pursuit of art, trying to make art. And that was a very important step for me. It was crucial. That became a dead-end road, this idea of I want to set out to make art. I soon realised that this is not something you set out to make. You set out to have a relationship, and the detritus of that can become something that maybe somewhere down the line someone might call it art, but it's not something to set out to make. It's not an end point. So at that time, I was living in the countryside and reinvesting in my love of nature, but also really thinking about what are the tools that I have to relate to things? What are the tools that I have to define myself against or in comparison to a tree or an animal or the grass or the mud? Who am I? When there was no one really else around to facilitate that, what do I have at my disposal? And that's when I was really aware of a cultural inadequacy. I don't really want to use science to do this. I don't really want to use romanticism to do this. How do I negotiate this? I can see that I'm vertical and standing up like the tree. What else is there, apart from a physical comparison? So yeah, it's an investigation of self, really, and understanding self, I think, at the centre of it all.
I had 2 childhood experiences that are overlap and are different. One was I found birds just beautiful, for reasons I don't know. And I can remember just sitting at the window at home, being struck by the fact they arrive from somewhere and you don't know where from, and they leave and you don't know where they're going to. And they are completely beyond your control. And I found this, for some reason, very, very amazing, wonderful. Coupled with that, there were woods quite near where I grew up. And I would go and sit in the woods, and to begin with, you would see and hear nothing. It was just pointless. And the longer you sat there, the more it emerged. And by the end, it was like a cacophony. There was so much sound and so much to see, but it took all that time for it to emerge. And I think it left me feeling that, that's what nature's like. It's all there, but you have to wait for it to come through in some sense. And it was so powerful.
Both of you have talked about the natural world as if you're absolutely part of it. I think the difficulty at the moment, with again a polarization, is that the natural world is somewhere else, and we're not part of it. We need to find a way back, as you said, Marcus.
And it's weird, isn't it? If you're not part of it, what are you part of? what else could you be but a piece of nature?
I think that's why going back to childhood is very interesting, and reconnecting with that curiosity and that reconnecting with that sort of fluid sense of self in the way that you are not made and you're not autonomous and you are just in relationship too. I think for me it was really uncovered when I have visited other cultures around the world, going to the Amazon or going to Australia and meeting Indigenous people or First Nation people in Canada. And really seeing how the natural world is interwoven in every aspect of not just identity and names, but language. In Ecuador, in the Amazon, just talking to a kid about what was going on around the village, interspersed into their words were animal sounds. And so it wasn't just the fact that they thought these animals and trees were their ancestors and they were related to them, but they were actually making the noises and sounds of these animals to infer meaning on things. And the stories were beyond our sense of imagination. I mean, they were just extraordinary. And these were stories about life and their history. And so I think the struggle for me as an artist is can we ever break those rational bonds within our imagination to go to places which don't have to be rationalized? And can we have some kind of reality there for ourselves where we do relate on that basis?
I mean, the last project that James and I did at Artangel was the ending of our time at Artangel. And that was a 4-year process for all kinds of reasons. I'd like to ask both of you about endings. I mean, when do you know that a work of art is finished? And when do you know that a process of therapy is over?
Two different questions. I imagine, I don't know, I can only speak for myself. I mean, when I write something, I know when it's finished. I couldn't give you my criteria or tell you why I think that, but that is the strong feeling. Paul Valery said, poems aren't finished, they're abandoned. And I think there's a sense in which that's true, as in, not that you can't go on, but you don't want to go on. It is finished. In therapy, it's a mutual agreement. So that if somebody wants to finish, I obviously wouldn't stop them, but I'd assume they wanted to finish either because they'd finished or because they were approaching something that was more difficult. And so I would want to negotiate that, but it would be by mutual agreement.
Yeah, for me, it's why does it need to be finished? I felt like I had a responsibility to create some kind of completion for the directors. And that was important, and for myself. So I think there was a sense that, okay, this needs to come to an end at some point. And how do we make that happen?
And the project's not over, right? So it's as I understand it, it's almost like circling back to some of its origins. You know, you mentioned observing in the Maudsley, and now the films are being used as part of a training process.
Yeah, they're available and they're being used. They're part of the King's College archive, which is a curriculum tool for the psychiatry department there. It's amazing the breadth of interest from these films, particularly from the clinical areas, from different psychiatric departments in hospitals, from GPs, and families of people who are in care. Yeah, and people particularly, which I hadn't foreseen at all, who have had relatives who committed suicide because of psychosis, and their struggle to understand what they went through and the sort of pain and the level of pain actually they were in. Watching the films has been quite a healing experience for them. So, yeah, it does continue, I think, and the conversation continues. But and how that's facilitated or how that goes into the world, I'm not entirely sure.
But that's the best outcome we could have hoped for, because one of your reasons for wanting to do it was to reduce stigma and increase understanding. And I think that the way it's landed with in training and higher education contexts shows that is a common desire.
Yeah, but I think it does feel like there's a sense of constraint in helping. What can we do? What can we understand? How can we relate? It started off as quite an internal conversation I was having with myself, really feeling my own difficulty with the situation. How do I talk to somebody? How do I start a conversation with someone who I can't relate to their experiences at all? Do I need to be different? Do I need special words? Do I need a special way to relate to them? And I think my first breakthrough was in that clinical environment was, no, I just need to talk about the weather. I just need to talk about very ordinary things. And I was making them into someone or something that they weren't. I was making them into their diagnosis. I was making them, they were their illness. They weren't the person in front of me. So that was the first sort of confrontation with my own stigma I had, I think.
It's interesting. It puts me in mind of a project you did, I think, 6 or 7 years ago called You Might As Well Ask a Crow, where you invited visitors to a gallery to pose questions to you that they'd found they struggled with. And one of the questions was, how do you set the boundaries of empathy? I know how you answered it then, but I wonder, post-directors, how you would answer it now, and whether, Adam, you think that empathy has boundaries.
Yeah, for me, it's, which I suppose I've sort of discovered later on as an artist, in that everything has to start from scratch every time. You can't really build one artwork on top of another. It's like you can't really build one relationship onto another, or even one experience of a relationship onto the next experience of that relationship. You do build a framework, but that framework needs to be reassessed all the time. So, yeah, for me, it's about how do you construct the language, how do you construct that framework to be able to build that relationship where you can have that empathy. And that's a constant negotiation, it feels like.
I mean, my assumption, or its presumption, is that developmentally we begin profoundly empathetic, i.e. we are other people, and they're us, and so on. And then there's a gradual process, depending on the culture you grew up in, of differentiation. And then it becomes a question, I think, of what you can bear identifying with in somebody else and what you find yourself resisting. But it would seem to me that the aim would be extending the range of one's conversational partners, and that where one is frightened, one should engage, if one can bear it.
Here is Where We Meet is devised by James Lingwood and Michael Morris, co-directors of Artangel from 1991 to 2023. The theme is composed by PJ Harvey. Millie Roberts is the production manager, and Matteo Pini is the editor. Nell Whitaker, Sorab Golsorki-Ainsley, and Thomas Ruche are executive producers. Otomi Larcher is the graphic designer, and Stephen Lewin is the audio engineer. Here is Where We Meet is an original podcast by Tank and is available on all good podcast platforms. The series is dedicated to the memory of John Berger, from whose book of imaginary conversations its title is taken.